What if the gods didn't vanish from Earth, but simply learned to rule without being seen? Picture it like footsteps stopping in a long corridor. No slammed door, no farewell, just silence. And then, strangest of all, everything keeps running exactly as before. Mesopotamian texts record something unsettling. There was a time when divine beings were described like direct administrators, assigning cities, distributing authority, issuing decrees, judging disputes, fixing destinies. And then, after a boundary event, the Great Flood, they no longer appear the same way. Here's the haunting part. The system they built does not collapse. It continues. It even strengthens. This isn't speculative fiction. It's embedded in thousands of cuneiform tablets spanning nearly 3,000 years of continuous civilization. Temple archives, royal inscriptions, law collections, ritual procedures, letters, receipts, inventories. The most mundane documents, often the most reliable, preserve a civilization that keeps behaving as though power originates beyond humanity, long after the source stops showing its face. In Mesopotamian vocabulary, the Anunnaki appear as a real category, not a modern invention, not a single character, but a collective presence tied to decision-making, judgment, decree, fate. Sometimes they are described as a council, sometimes as underworld judges, sometimes as decree makers who confirm the architecture of order. Whatever the context, they are rarely just poetic decoration. They are infrastructure. Then something happens. Water, wind, rupture. After the flood, the texts still speak of divine authority, still name gods as sources of kingship, law, legitimacy, and cosmic order. But the gods no longer stand in the room the way earlier narratives portray them. They stop acting as visible executives and become invisible authors. And what's chilling is how little changes on the surface. Kings still rule by divine mandate. Priests still guard divine knowledge. Laws still descend from heaven. Temples remain points of contact with the sky. The entire architecture of power, everything that tells society who may command and who must obey, remains intact. Only the gods themselves are no longer physically present in the same narrative way. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. If the Anunnaki and their divine peers were once described as rulers who walked among humanity, and if their rule shifts into invisibility after the flood, while their institutions remain perfectly functional, what kind of disappearance leaves behind a world that still obeys? One document captures this transition with disturbing clarity: the Sumerian king list. It survives in multiple copies found at different sites. It isn't a lone myth drifting in isolation. It's a document shaped like a record: cities, dynasties, sequences of rulers. And what makes it unforgettable is its structure. It reads like a chain with a single hinge in the middle. Before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kingship is not described as a human invention. It descends from heaven. The text doesn't present this as metaphor. It presents it as transfer of authority, as though legitimacy itself arrives from a non-human realm and installs itself on earth. It names specific cities. It names specific rulers. It records a sequence of power, like a ledger. Then the flood sweeps over. After the flood, the list continues in the same documentary voice, the same rhythm, the same claims about kingship as a heavenly institution. But now, the list begins to include rulers whose existence can be supported by archaeology, names that appear on artifacts, foundation deposits, inscriptions, temple objects, figures that sit closer to the historical horizon. And this creates a problem that never goes away. If the post-flood section is treated as a legitimate historical tradition, often cross-checked, debated, sometimes supported, then what do we do with the pre-flood section when it is written by the same scribes, in the same style, within the same continuous narrative? The document itself does not draw a bright line. It does not say, myth above, history below. It presents divine origin rule and human dynasties as one chain, interrupted only by catastrophe. The king list is only the beginning. When you widen the lens to the full Mesopotamian record, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, an eerie pattern becomes visible across centuries. In earlier compositions, gods appear as actors, convening assemblies, issuing decisions, assigning jurisdictions, intervening directly, arguing, negotiating, enforcing. In later records, those same gods remain the source of legitimacy. They still grant kingship, still determine destinies, still authorize laws, still own temples and cities, but they operate through intermediaries. Kings govern as appointed stewards. Priests manage access to divine will. Justice is administered in the name of heaven. The gods do not fade into poetry, they fade into procedure. And that distinction matters, because many cultures simply forget their gods over time, or convert them into symbols, or turn them into literature. Mesopotamia does something stranger. It keeps the gods central, but relocates them from visible presence to invisible authority. The system does not become less religious. It becomes more institutional. You can feel this in the prologues of law collections, in royal inscriptions, in coronation rituals, in the harsh bureaucratic texts of temple accounting, where the god remains named as owner, while humans do the work. Divine power does not vanish. It becomes a framework, a justification engine, a permanent background fact. Which brings us to the core of this investigation. In the oldest sources, there is no departure narrative, no final decree, no farewell assembly, no dramatic ascension. Instead, what shifts is the mode of presence. At first, gods are characters. Later, gods are authors. At first, gods do the ruling. Later, gods authorize the ruling. At first, gods stand beside humanity. Later, gods stand behind everything. And here is where the silence becomes the loudest evidence. Because if a ruling power learns to govern from behind the curtain, through mandates, bloodlines, law, ritual, and constant interpretation, then physical presence becomes optional. In fact, invisibility may be more effective than appearance. A visible authority can be tested, questioned, resisted. A hidden authority can be invoked endlessly without ever being forced to prove itself in the open. So before we can interpret what this withdrawal means, we have to reconstruct what divine rule looked like when it was described most directly. Not as vague cosmic forces, not as distant metaphors, but as a structured administration with councils, jurisdictions, decrees, and protocols. Because once you see that structure clearly, the next question becomes sharper and far more unsettling. If the gods stopped appearing, why did their governance architecture remain so perfectly intact? And if a civilization can be ruled by an authority it never sees, how would it even recognize the moment it stopped being ruled by heaven? To understand what the withdrawal of the gods actually meant, we have to look carefully at what divine rule looked like before anything changed. Not as metaphor, not as symbolism layered on later belief, but as it appears in the earliest Mesopotamian sources themselves, where gods are described less like distant forces and more like administrators operating a system. In the oldest narratives, divine authority is not abstract. It is procedural. Texts such as the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, and portions of the Enuma Elish describe the gods acting through councils, debates, negotiations, and delegated responsibility. Decisions are not issued by a single omnipotent voice. They are discussed, disputed, ratified. Authority is collective and structured. The Anunnaki appear within this framework as a governing body. Sometimes they are described as judges of fate, other times as overseers of cosmic order. In many contexts, they function like a high council whose role is to confirm decrees that affect both gods and humans. Fate itself is not random, it is administered. Each major god holds a defined jurisdiction. Enlil governs atmosphere, wind, and command. Enki controls fresh water, wisdom, craft, and problem-solving. Inanna oversees warfare, sexuality, and political power. Utu administers justice and oaths. Nanna governs cycles, time, and legitimacy. These are not poetic associations. They are operational domains. The texts treat them the way an administrative system treats departments. At the center of this structure is the Sumerian concept of me. The me are often translated as divine decrees or cosmic ordinances, but those translations flatten their meaning. The me are not moral principles. They are functional components of civilization itself. Kingship, priesthood, law, writing. music, craftsmanship, sexual relations, truth-telling, warfare, temple construction. According to Sumerian tradition, these were not invented gradually by humans. They were delivered as a complete system. Civilization did not evolve upward, it was installed. One myth, Inanna and Enki, makes this explicit. In the story, Inanna acquires the Me from Enki and transports them to her city, Uruk. The language is not symbolic of inspiration. It is logistical. The goddess carries civilization's operating instructions from one divine administrator to another and implements them in a specific urban center. This matters because it reveals how the Mesopotamians understood power. Cities were not human property. They belonged to gods. Each major city-state identified itself as the estate of a patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Eridu to Enki, Ur to Nanna. The god was the legal owner. The population were tenants. The land, the canals, the herds, the workshops, all were divine property managed on the god's behalf. The temple was not primarily a place of worship. It was headquarters. Temple archives excavated from sites like Lagash and Girsu preserve thousands of administrative tablets documenting daily operations, grain allocations, livestock counts, textile production, labor assignments, land leases. These are not prayers. They are accounting records, and they are written as though the god is the institutional owner. Priests in this system were not spiritual guides in the modern sense. They were managers, scribes, accountants, technicians. They maintained the god's household. They fed the cult statue. They supervised workers. They recorded transactions. They enforced contracts sworn in the god's name. And crucially, this system assumes divine presence. The god was believed to reside physically in the cult statue within the inner sanctuary. Offerings were meals, rituals were maintenance, music was entertainment, incense was hospitality. The god was there. Kings operated within this framework as appointed stewards. A Mesopotamian king did not rule instead of the god. He ruled for the god. He enforced divine law. He protected divine property. He led rituals that maintained cosmic order. He judged disputes as an extension of the god's justice. This is why early kingship is never presented as a human invention. Kingship exists first in the divine realm. Humans are selected to occupy it temporarily. So in the earliest phase, the system looks like this. Gods actively govern. Cities are divine estates. Temples are administrative centers. Priests manage divine property. Kings execute divine authority. Everything is coherent because the gods are assumed to be present, which is why the later shift is so unsettling. Because when the gods stop appearing as direct actors, none of this infrastructure is dismantled. The temples do not close. The archives continue. The rituals intensify. The priesthood expands. Kings still claim divine appointment. The god becomes an absent landlord. And this raises a question that ancient scribes never addressed directly, but that emerges clearly when we read across centuries. At what point does management replace presence? There is no tablet that says, the gods have left. No ritual text that records the last time a god responded visibly. Instead, the texts simply stop describing gods as characters in contemporary events. They move from narrative to justification. The gods are no longer shown deciding. They are cited as having decided. They are no longer seen assigning. They are referenced as the source of assignment. They are no longer present in councils. They are invoked in prologues. And yet, the system functions more efficiently than ever. This is where the transition becomes clear. Divine authority is no longer maintained by appearance. It is maintained by structure. Once authority is embedded in law, bloodline, ritual, and institutional memory, it no longer requires the gods to show up. Their presence is preserved in process, which leads to the next step in the transformation. If gods no longer rule directly, how is their authority preserved? The answer lies in something Mesopotamia perfected very early: kingship as a heavenly institution rather than a human role. And that is where the story turns from divine administration to divine inheritance. If divine authority could no longer rely on visible presence, it needed something more durable than appearance, something that could survive generations. something that could persist even when the gods themselves remained unseen. That solution was kingship, not as political convenience, but as a heavenly institution. The Mesopotamian texts are explicit about this. Kingship is not created by humans. It does not emerge from conquest, consensus, or tradition. It descends. Again and again, the same formula appears. Kingship descended from heaven, not symbolically, structurally. The Sumerian king list opens with this declaration before naming a single ruler. Authority exists first beyond the human world. Only afterward is it installed on earth. The implication is precise. Humans do not generate legitimacy. They receive it. This idea transforms power into something untouchable. A throne is no longer just a seat won by force. It is an office anchored in the cosmic order. To challenge it is not merely rebellion. It is resistance to the structure of reality itself. And this is where the continuity becomes disturbing. The king list does not separate mythic time from historical time. It treats pre-flood rulers and post-flood kings as participants in the same system. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again and resumes its sequence at the city of Kish. The chain is unbroken. What changes is not the source of authority, but the scale of time. The earliest kings rule for impossibly long periods. Later kings rule for human lifespans, but the document never questions the legitimacy of either. Both are presented as equally sanctioned. Some of the post-flood names in the list, like En-Mebaragesi of Kish, are historically attested. His name appears on excavated inscriptions. His existence is not speculative. Gilgamesh, too, occupies this boundary zone, half mythic, half historical, yet fully embedded in the king list as a legitimate ruler. This creates an uncomfortable overlap. If the list is treated as credible historical memory in its later sections, then its earlier claims cannot be dismissed without explanation. The scribes did not mark a transition from fiction to fact. They recorded a continuous inheritance of authority, which suggests that for them, divine rule did not end. It changed form. Kingship becomes the mechanism by which divine authority remains embodied after the gods withdraw from direct action. The king is not divine in essence, at least not always, but he is divinely installed. His authority flows downward from heaven through ritual, lineage, and proclamation. Royal inscriptions reinforce this relentlessly. When a king introduces himself, he does not say, "I conquered," or "I was chosen by the people." He says he was named by the gods, called by the gods, raised up by the gods. His reign is made firm by divine will. Hammurabi's law code begins this way. So does Ur-Nammu's. So does Lipit Ishtar's. Across centuries, the language barely changes. Kings are never authors of law. They are receivers. This framing solves a crucial problem. If divine authority is invisible, how can it remain unquestioned? By embedding it in blood. Over time, kingship becomes hereditary. Authority passes from father to son, not merely as political inheritance, but as sacred transmission. Royal bloodlines are not just familial, they are theological. The right to rule is carried in lineage. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine. His mother is a goddess. This is not poetic exaggeration within its cultural context. It is genealogical legitimacy. The ruler's body itself becomes proof of divine connection. Later kings are more restrained in their claims, but the principle remains. Dynasties are favored, families are chosen, genealogies are preserved with obsessive care. To rule without the correct bloodline is to lack legitimacy, regardless of power. This makes authority self-sustaining. The gods do not need to appear again to choose each new king. The choice was already made, embedded in lineage. Each successor inherits not just land and crown, but divine authorization itself. This is one of the most effective technologies of power ever developed, because once legitimacy is hereditary, it becomes nearly impossible to challenge without dismantling the entire cosmic framework. You can overthrow a ruler, but you cannot argue with blood. This is why royal marriages mattered so deeply. They were not just alliances, they were mechanisms for preserving divine continuity. Sacred unions, like the ritual marriage between king and priestess representing Inanna, reenacted cosmic relationships and reinforced the divine human bond. The throne becomes the last visible remnant of divine presence. The god no longer stands in the city, but the king does. He wears the symbols, performs the rituals, speaks the decrees, enacts the justice. His body occupies the space the god once filled. And because the king's authority is framed as heavenly in origin, obedience becomes a religious obligation. Disobedience becomes sacrilege. This is why the withdrawal of the gods does not weaken the system. It perfects it. Direct divine rule invites doubt. A god who appears can be questioned, tested, resisted. But a god who rules through lineage and law cannot be confronted. The authority is always one step removed, always from heaven. And now another institution becomes indispensable. If kings rule by divine mandate, someone must confirm that mandate. Someone must interpret the signs. Someone must maintain the channel between heaven and throne. That role belongs to the priesthood, and with that, the system closes in on itself. Divine authority flows from heaven into kingship. Kingship is validated by priestly mediation. Priests derive authority from the gods. The gods are known only through priests and kings. The circle is complete. The gods may no longer walk among humanity, but their rule has never been more secure. And the next question becomes unavoidable. If priests control access to divine will, what happens when divine communication itself becomes invisible? That is where we must turn next, into omens, rituals, and the art of reading the gods when they no longer speak aloud. Once divine authority is embedded in kingship and preserved through bloodline, the system still requires one more element to remain functional: communication. A king may rule by divine mandate, but mandate must be confirmed. Law may descend from heaven, but heaven no longer speaks directly. If the gods have withdrawn from visible presence, how does a civilization know what the gods want? Mesopotamia's answer is precise and systematic. The gods never stopped communicating. They stopped speaking plainly. And the responsibility for interpreting their will fell to a professional class whose power grew quietly as divine presence faded: the priesthood. Temples in Mesopotamia were never designed as places for communal gathering in the modern sense. They were houses, residences. The god lived there. The cult statue was not a symbol. It was the physical seat of divine presence. And when the god ceased to appear openly, the statue did not lose its role. Instead, it became the focal point of a new kind of authority. Priests did not replace the gods. They became the interface. Archaeological excavations from temple complexes like Nippur, Lagash, and Babylon reveal institutions of immense complexity. These were not contemplative spaces. They were bureaucratic machines. Thousands of workers, massive agricultural estates, breweries, textile workshops, livestock holdings, long-distance trade networks, all documented in clay tablets. But administration was only one side of priestly power. The other was interpretation. When gods no longer issued direct commands, their will had to be extracted from signs embedded in the world itself. Mesopotamian culture developed one of the most elaborate systems of divination ever recorded, not as superstition, but as technical practice. Everything could be a message: the sky, the liver of a sacrificed animal, the pattern of oil on water, a dream, an eclipse, a malformed birth. These were not random omens. They were treated as structured communication. Specialist priests, known as baru, trained for years to read these signs. They studied vast omen compendia, thousands of tablets cataloguing correlations between specific signs and specific outcomes. If X appears, Y will follow. The logic was conditional, systematic, almost algorithmic. Extispicy, the reading of animal organs, was the most prestigious form. Clay models of sheep livers have been excavated, covered in inscriptions marking zones, shapes, anomalies. Each feature carried meaning. The gods were believed to inscribe their judgment directly into the body of the sacrificial animal. Astral divination followed the same logic. The heavens became a text. Eclipses, planetary alignments, unusual star movements, everything was recorded in astronomical diaries and matched with earthly events. Over centuries, priests built databases linking sky patterns to political outcomes, military success, famine, rebellion. The message was clear: the gods are watching. They may not appear, but they observe constantly, and they communicate continuously if you know how to read. This changes the nature of divine presence entirely. The gods no longer intervene through action. They intervene through interpretation. And interpretation requires specialists, which means access to divine will becomes centralized, controlled, and exclusive. Only priests can read the signs. Only priests can confirm whether the gods approve. Only priests can say whether a king's rule remains divinely sanctioned. This creates dependency. A king cannot act without consultation. A campaign cannot begin without omens. A law cannot be enacted without ritual confirmation. Even postponing a public appearance might depend on an eclipse report. Neo-Assyrian royal correspondence preserves this vividly. Letters between kings and court astrologers show rulers delaying actions, altering decisions, and retreating indoors based on celestial observations. One message warns a king not to leave his palace due to an impending eclipse. Another reassures him that the eclipse signifies danger for his enemies, not himself. The signs are flexible, and that flexibility is power. Because the gods never speak clearly enough to contradict interpretation, the system is brilliant in its subtlety. If gods spoke directly, they could be challenged. But if gods communicate through ambiguous signs, disagreement becomes a matter of interpretation, not truth. And interpretation belongs to institutions. Divine authority no longer needs physical presence. It needs procedures. And those procedures are guarded. Literacy is restricted. Omen texts are specialized. Ritual knowledge is controlled. The divine voice becomes something only professionals can access. At this stage, the architecture is nearly complete. Kings embody divine mandate. Priests interpret divine will. Temples control resources. Law carries heavenly origin. The gods observe silently. And society continues to function as if the gods are still watching, because in a sense, they are. Not as beings in the street, but as an omnipresent gaze embedded in nature, ritual, and fear. This is where divine withdrawal becomes something else entirely. Not absence, surveillance. A god who is visible can be resisted. A god who is invisible but watching is far more powerful. And now, with kingship and priesthood aligned, one final component emerges, something that locks obedience into everyday life itself. Law, not as human agreement, but as cosmic command. And that is where we must go next. By the time divine authority had been embedded in kingship and filtered through priestly interpretation, one final mechanism was required to make the system permanent. Law. Not law as negotiation, not law as human compromise, but law as something received, fixed, unquestionable, and older than any ruler who enforced it. In Mesopotamia, law is never presented as a human invention. It is revealed. The earliest law codes do not begin with social problems or political goals. They begin with gods. Ur-Nammu's code opens by stating that the gods An and Enlil granted kingship and charged the king with establishing justice. Lipit Ishtar's laws follow the same pattern. Hammurabi's famous stele makes the point unmistakable. The king stands before the sun god Shamash, receiving the symbols of authority. The image comes before the laws. The message is clear. The king does not author justice. He transmits it. The prologue to Hammurabi's code is not decorative theology. It is a declaration of source. Anu and Enlil determine destiny. Marduk is elevated. Hammurabi is named. Only then do the laws appear. Law flows downward. And because it flows from heaven, it cannot be argued with on human terms. Each statute follows a strict conditional structure. If a certain act occurs, then a specific consequence follows. There is no debate, no appeal to intent, no philosophical reasoning. The law is not justified, it is applied. What matters is not whether the law is fair, but whether it aligns with divine order. This transforms obedience. Breaking the law is no longer merely a civic offense. It is a violation of cosmic balance. Justice is not something negotiated between people. It is something enforced on behalf of unseen authorities. And the law does not need the gods to appear in court. The stele itself becomes a witness. Hammurabi's epilogue invites the wronged to come before the monument, to have the words read aloud, to let the stone clarify the case. The law speaks. The god does not need to. Stone replaces presence. This pattern repeats across Mesopotamian legal tradition. Laws are always framed as part of a divine mission. Kings present themselves as agents executing heavenly instruction. The more the gods withdraw from narrative action, the more law claims divine authorship. And law reaches into every corner of life: property, marriage, inheritance, labor, injury, medicine, agriculture, trade, false accusation, oaths. Everything is regulated, and every regulation is anchored in divine authority, which creates an extraordinary effect. Human society becomes governed by rules that no human is allowed to question. If law came from kings, it could be revised. If law came from elders, it could be challenged. If law came from consensus, it could evolve. But law that comes from heaven is immune. This is how divine withdrawal becomes irrelevant. The gods do not need to appear if their will has already been carved into stone and embedded into daily life. Every contract sworn invokes them. Every court judgment echoes them. Every punishment reinforces their authority. The system becomes self-enforcing. And now, consider what this means psychologically. A person may never see a god. They may never hear a divine voice. But every boundary they cross, every oath they swear, every judgment they fear reminds them that authority is watching. The gods have become omnipresent without being visible. This is not accidental. It is the most efficient form of control imaginable. Visible power can be confronted. Invisible power becomes internalized. People obey not because they see enforcement, but because they assume oversight. And this is why the Mesopotamian system does not collapse when the gods disappear from narrative visibility. It does not need them to return. Their authority has been externalized into institutions, texts, rituals, and fear. But something even more sophisticated develops alongside divine law, a way to maintain the sense that the gods are not just authors of the past, but active observers of the present. A system that turns the entire world into a message. That system is divination. And once law defines what must be obeyed, divination defines what must be feared. That is where the architecture becomes complete. And that is where we turn next. If law established what must be obeyed, divination established something far more powerful: the belief that obedience was constantly being monitored. In Mesopotamia, the gods did not vanish into silence. They transformed into observers. By the late Sumerian and Babylonian periods, divine authority no longer needed to speak directly. It only needed to signal. And those signals were believed to be everywhere. The sky became a text. The body became a message. Chance itself became communication. This was not vague superstition. It was systematized knowledge. Thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Assyria and Babylonia record omen literature in obsessive detail. These were not poetic prophecies. They were technical manuals, catalogues of cause and effect compiled over centuries. If the moon is eclipsed in the month of Ululu, the king will face rebellion. If Jupiter stands in the constellation of the Lion, the harvest will prosper. If a sheep's liver bears a mark on the right lobe, the campaign will fail. Each omen follows a precise formula: condition, outcome, interpretation. The assumption behind this system is chillingly simple. The gods are always watching. They are always communicating. And nothing happens by accident. The most prestigious form of divination was extispicy, the reading of animal organs, especially the liver. The liver was believed to be the tablet upon which the gods wrote their response to a question posed before sacrifice. This was not improvisation. Clay models of livers have been found, inscribed with labels marking every section and its meaning. Priests trained for years to read these signs with technical precision. Before a king went to war, a sheep was sacrificed. Before a treaty was signed, a liver was examined. Before a public appearance, omens were checked. Even eclipses were not simply feared. They were analyzed. Assyrian court letters reveal kings postponing decisions, cancelling journeys, or performing substitute rituals based on astronomical warnings. In some cases, a temporary substitute king was placed on the throne during an eclipse to absorb divine punishment meant for the true ruler. This is governance through fear without force. The gods never appear, yet every decision bends around their assumed judgment. Divination turns uncertainty into control. If the future is dangerous, only specialists can interpret it. If the gods speak through signs, only trained priests can hear them. If divine will is encoded in nature, power belongs to those who can decode it, and this completes the structure. Kings rule by divine mandate. Law enforces divine order. Priests interpret divine signals, and the people live under constant awareness of invisible oversight. The brilliance of this system is that it does not require divine intervention. The gods never need to descend. They never need to speak. They never need to correct the system. Their absence becomes their strength, because invisible authority cannot be disproven. If a prophecy fails, it was misread. If disaster strikes, the signs were ignored. If power abuses authority, it was still divinely sanctioned. The system protects itself by making doubt indistinguishable from disobedience. And this is where the Anunnaki cease to function as characters in stories and become something far more enduring. They become infrastructure, not gods who act, but gods who authorize. Not rulers who govern, but a framework that governs without them. And once a civilization internalizes the belief that authority originates beyond humanity, it no longer needs the gods to appear. It only needs the system they left behind. But this raises a deeper and more dangerous question. If divine authority can operate perfectly without divine presence, then how do you ever know when the gods are truly gone, or whether they were meant to leave at all? To answer that, we must look at what never disappeared: blood, lineage, and the idea that power itself is inherited, not chosen. That is where the final layer of control emerges. And that is where we go next. Once divine authority was embedded in bloodlines, it still required one final reinforcement: the certainty that nothing escaped divine notice. The gods might no longer rule openly. They might no longer speak directly, but they were believed to be watching constantly. This is where surveillance replaces presence. In late Mesopotamian civilization, especially during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, the Anunnaki are no longer portrayed as rulers who act. They are observers who record. The world itself becomes a monitoring system. The sky is the primary instrument. Astronomy is not curiosity, it is theology. Priests maintain detailed celestial diaries tracking the movement of the moon, planets, stars, eclipses, comets, and atmospheric anomalies. These records are not speculative. They are administrative documents, consulted before military campaigns, coronations, legal decisions, and public rituals. Nothing important happens without consulting the heavens. If an eclipse appears, it is not random. It is targeted. It carries intention. It signals judgment. And judgment always has an object. Often, that object is the king. Assyrian court records preserve letters where astrologer priests warn the king not to appear in public, not to travel, not to act, because the signs are unfavorable. In some cases, a substitute king is installed temporarily to absorb divine punishment. A man is crowned, then executed once the danger has passed. The gods never appear, but fear governs every decision. This creates a civilization that behaves as if it is under constant inspection. Divination expands beyond the sky. Dreams are analyzed. Oil poured into water is read. Birth defects are catalogued. Animal behavior is recorded. Every deviation from expectation becomes a potential message. And who controls interpretation? The priesthood. This is the critical point. When gods are visible, their authority can be tested. When gods are invisible, interpretation becomes power. Priests are no longer servants of the gods. They are translators of reality. They decide which signs matter. They decide what the gods are saying. They decide when divine approval exists or has been withdrawn. The system becomes closed. If an omen fails, it was misunderstood. If disaster strikes, warnings were ignored. If a king falls, the gods had spoken. The framework cannot be falsified, and this is what makes the architecture so durable. The gods are no longer needed as actors. They have become assumptions. Invisible authority is more powerful than visible force because it operates internally. People regulate themselves. Kings fear signs they cannot see. Populations obey laws they believe are watched by cosmic eyes. Surveillance without presence, judgment without appearance, control without intervention. This is not myth. It is documented administration. The Anunnaki do not fade. They reconfigure. They stop ruling and begin overseeing. And once a society accepts that unseen powers constantly monitor behavior, the system becomes eternal. But there is still one unresolved tension. If the gods never appear, if authority is inherited, if surveillance is symbolic, At what point does the system stop serving the gods and begin serving itself? And more importantly, how would anyone living inside it ever know? That is the final question. At this stage, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. The system no longer needs belief. It only needs continuity. By the late Mesopotamian period, divine authority has been fully abstracted. The gods are not present. Their voices are never heard directly. Yet obedience remains absolute. Kings rule. Laws bind. Temples dominate. Priests interpret. Omens warn. Bloodlines inherit. Nothing essential depends on the gods showing themselves, which forces a deeper question. If the Anunnaki were once rulers, and if their withdrawal did not weaken the system, but perfected it, then what exactly ended? The texts never say the gods left. They say something far more subtle. They stop appearing. There is no rupture, no rebellion, no victory of humanity over divine power. Civilization does not celebrate independence. Instead, it behaves as if divine authority has become permanent, embedded, unquestionable. The gods transition from governors to assumptions. This is why the Mesopotamian record feels different from mythology elsewhere. Greek gods fade into stories. Egyptian gods merge into symbolism. But Mesopotamian divine authority becomes procedural. It hardens into administration. Kings no longer wait for gods to speak. They act in anticipation of what the gods would want. Priests no longer transmit divine commands. They maintain divine continuity. Law no longer responds to divine judgment. It is divine judgment. This is the moment where power no longer requires heaven. It only requires memory, and memory is easier to control than presence. Because memory can be curated. Notice what happens to time. The Sumerian king list does not separate myth from history. It blends them deliberately. Pre-flood rulers with impossibly long reigns stand beside historically verified kings like Enmebaragesi and Gilgamesh. The document makes no distinction because it does not need to. The past is made continuous. If kingship has always descended from heaven, then it does not matter whether heaven still sends kings. The authority remains intact because it always has. This is not deception in the modern sense. It is structural continuity. The system is designed so that questioning origins destabilizes everything. If authority once came from gods, and if all authority since then traces back to that moment, then challenging the present means challenging the entire past. And societies rarely survive that. So instead, the narrative stabilizes. The gods are honored, the rituals continue, the laws are enforced, the kings rule. And no one asks why the gods no longer appear, because the question has become irrelevant. This is how divine rule becomes invisible rule, not through suppression, through normalization. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, power has become fully bureaucratic. Vast administrative networks govern agriculture, trade, taxation, labor, and military logistics. The empire functions through documents, seals, rosters, omens, rituals, and decrees. And every layer still references divine authority. But not once does the system require proof. The Anunnaki do not need to be real to be effective. They only need to be foundational. This is the most unsettling realization of all. Whether the gods were literal beings, symbolic forces, or memories of something older, their disappearance does not weaken their control. It completes it. Because visible rulers can be overthrown, invisible authority becomes internalized. Once power is embedded into law, lineage, ritual, and fear of cosmic judgment, it no longer depends on belief. It becomes habit, tradition, obedience without question. At that point, even if the gods returned, nothing would change. The system would continue to function exactly as it does now. And that raises the final, unavoidable thought. If authority can operate perfectly without its creators, then how do we know when they are truly gone? Or whether the system was always meant to run without them? That is the silence left behind by the Anunnaki. And it is not empty. It is filled with order. And so we arrive at the quiet ending that Mesopotamian texts never give us. There is no final tablet, no record of departure, no moment when the gods announce they are leaving the world behind. There is only continuity. Kings continue to rule as if chosen. Laws continue to bind as if authored by heaven. Priests continue to interpret signs as if watched. Civilization continues to obey as if nothing has changed. The Anunnaki do not vanish in fire or thunder. They dissolve into structure. What once appeared as gods walking among humans becomes something far more enduring. a blueprint for authority that no longer needs its architects. Whether the Anunnaki were literal beings, symbolic expressions, or memories of something older than recorded history is ultimately less important than what their story leaves behind. The system attributed to them works. It survives catastrophes, empires, languages, and belief systems. It adapts. It migrates. It reappears under new names. Divine kingship becomes sacred monarchy. Priestly mediation becomes institutional authority. Heavenly law becomes unquestionable doctrine. Omens become ideology. Bloodlines become legitimacy. The architecture remains even when the names change. This is why the Mesopotamian record feels unsettling. It does not describe liberation from the gods. It describes a world that learned how to function as if divine authority were permanent, even when divine presence was gone. And that may be the most profound legacy of the Anunnaki. Not that they ruled the world, but that they designed a world capable of ruling itself in their absence. A system where power claims origin beyond humanity, where obedience is framed as cosmic necessity, where authority becomes invisible, inherited, unquestioned. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because the question this story leaves us with is not about ancient gods. It is about us. How much of our world still operates on foundations we no longer examine? How many systems demand obedience by claiming origins beyond challenge? And how would we recognize freedom if authority no longer has a face? The clay tablets do not answer these questions. They simply leave them behind, waiting.